right, everyone. So today we're going to finish up Unit 7, and we're talking about mass atrocities. And what we're talking about is going to be about what's going on during the 20th century primarily, so all the way from like World War I and onward and into the later parts of the decolonization, things that we'll talk about more so in Unit 8. But I do want to warn you that there are some disturbing images as part of this presentation today. There is no essential question, but make sure that you are listening and understanding why these genocides and atrocities do happen, where they happen, and who's committing them. But the historical development is the rise of extremist groups in power led to the attempted destruction of specific populations, notably the Nazi killing of Jews in the Holocaust during World War II and other atrocities, acts of genocide, and or ethnic violence. So we're going to go through some main examples today, but we're going to focus a lot about what the Holocaust was and how it occurred. And then we'll talk in more brief terms about some other acts of genocide and ethnic violence. So what is the Holocaust? Basic definition is the state-sponsored systematic persecution and mass extermination of Jews, or the Romani people, homosexuals, and Slavic people. And the Romanis, more commonly referred to as gypsies. And while gypsies is more commonly considered a derogatory term, there's not unlikely that you might see that term come up. So the term gypsy is simply the Romani people who live in parts of Europe themselves. So we're going to start with how this all begins. And the anti-Semitism that existed in Europe was not a new phenomenon that was created and perpetrated by the Nazis alone. It's something that had been around for a long time. And in Germany, in particular, the Jews were the largest of the minority groups living within their empire. And when World War I happened, the Nazis, blamed the failures of Germany not being able to win World War I in part to Jews and positions they held within society, and like bankers not giving enough money to help for the cause. So once the Nazis get into power, they began to start creating laws that will separate the Jews from the rest of German society. And so the Nuremberg race laws would define what a Jew was, and a Jew was considered anybody who had 3 of their 4 grandparents to be Jewish of descent. Once you were identified as a Jew by the Nuremberg laws, they stripped them away from their citizenship and took away any political rights and power that they had within Germany. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to hold German flags or fly German flags on their homes. They weren't allowed to have German-sounding names. They're trying to keep them segregated from the society as much as possible. Jews weren't allowed to employ German domestic servants because then the Nazis' mantra belief is that the Aryan people should be the master race and that all others should serve them. And it also prohibited sexual relations and marriages between Aryans and Jews, going back to this idea of eugenics, where they want to keep the purity of Aryan blood as much as possible. So they want to separate them as much as they can. So really, it's starting to identify them as being sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Identifying them as being completely separate of German, so it's easier to discriminate against them later on. As time goes on, they begin to become identified within society by requiring Jews to wear patches on their clothing anytime they were in public. Of course, you see the patch here. It says Jud, which is Jew in German, and they were expected to wear them in public, and it must be visible at all times. If they were caught without wearing it, there were very harsh punishments, arrests, sent to labor camps and other things that would happen. But badges themselves would not just be about identifying in public. It also will happen when they are ultimately sent to concentration camps. And it's not just Jews. Remember, it's not just Jews that are being sent to the concentration camps that are part of the Holocaust. It's other groups that they considered undesirable in Nazi Germany. And so you can see here this particular graph here, the different identifying marks that existed in the camps, and yes, you can have some of them. Upside down purple triangle was Jehovah's Witnesses. Upside down red triangles were communists. Upside down pink triangles were homosexuals. These were people that were considered undesirable in Nazi Germany, and so they segregate them from society. And this is something that they continue to use as identifying markers when they get to concentration camps. So when this all starts to happen, and a lot of Jews anti-Semitism is not a new thing, but they don't realize how bad it's going to get. The thing that really sets off this trigger that this is not good, we are in trouble, was Kristallnacht. This is the night of broken glass. And to give you some understanding context of why this really happens, the Nazis have been promoting this idea that Jews are all part of this grand conspiracy that are trying to keep the Aryans down. They're trying to keep the German state down in a way, right? And they're all in cahoots together. So the act of one Jew is like, all Jews are somehow responsible for that. And so in France, a German diplomat was killed, supposedly by a French Jew. But it was used as an excuse to wage large-scale violence and intimidation against the Jewish populations in Germany. So across Germany, stormtroopers, German citizens, they began to attack Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues. Breaking the glass of windows, looting, ransacking, and burning down synagogues across the country. And so this wide-scale violence, this is the first time we see this wide-scale violence against Jews. Before it was intimidation, it was name-calling, and certain looks that they were getting in public and things like that. But now it's getting much more violent and tense as a result of that. So many Jews are going to try to escape Germany, and at that point, Austria, which was under occupation from the Nazis. And the Jews are going to attempt to leave, and many of them will move to countries that are neighboring states to Germany and Austria. Some will try to come to the United States, but during that time, the United States had immigration laws, that prevented them from being able to have too many to come into the country from Germany and Austria at one single time. They did give a very famous physicist, Albert Einstein, refugee status to be able to move to the United States. And why wouldn't you? He was one of the most brilliant minds of his era. But everyday Jews, were generally denied. The story of the SS St. Louis, a ship that was full of Jewish refugees who attempted to find refugee status in Asylum in Cuba. Cuba denied them. They came to the United States. They asked the president to give them asylum status. It was denied because of the Emergency Quota Act and because the Great Depression was going on. So, and the fact that the United States was generally believing that isolationism, we don't want to involve ourselves in the problems of the world. And so many of them were forced to return back to Europe, and many of them would end up being killed in the concentration camps, even though they had tried to escape. As the war goes on, there is a general distrust of the Jews, and there's policies that the German government will undertake in Germany, as well as the territories that they've been taken off, to round up Jews and segregate them from society altogether. And so in cities, they would use the more dilapidated and rundown parts of cities to move Jews into, simply known as the ghettos. And the most infamous of these ghettos was in Warsaw, in Poland, the capital of Poland, where they created the ghettos that were surrounded by brick walls and underarmed guard, and Jews would be expected to live in there. And so with very little warning, many Jews, when this happened, were told, grab all the stuff that you can carry. You're leaving and you're not coming back to your house. You're moving into this part of the city where many Jews who are living, luxurious lifestyles end up living in an apartment with, 5 other families. And so things are very cramped in the ghettos. And then at the same time, there are a lot of Jews who are being segregated from society that are not living in cities, and so they would be sent to camps as labor camps, and in those labor camps they would build stuff that would be necessary for the war effort for Germany. But anyway, Jews were allowed to leave the ghettos under armed guard to go find work, but they were not allowed to freely roam. And so as the war progresses and Germany has invaded the Soviet Union, where there are a large number of Jewish populations, there is this overarching question of what to do with the Jews. I'm going to take myself off of my arm. Okay. So what's going to happen is that you do have these death squads made up of the Waffen SS, which was the more radicalized extremist soldiers within the German Wehrmacht. It was almost like a cult led by a guy named Heinrich Himmler. And Himmler is going to order that, if you find Jews, you execute them. And so you have a lot of mass graves that be built. So these are things that are going on as they take over more parts. But the Jewish question for people living in the ghettos, the labor camps and such, is what to do with the Jews. And then a lot of resources that were being used to hunt down the Jews become more strained as the war progresses. So then the final solution is what it becomes known as, is going to be discussed at something known as the Wannsee Conference. And you'll have members of the Nazi Party and high-ranking members within the German government come together to come up with what to do with the Jews. And the two men that are leading this, Heinrich Reinhardt, he is the intelligence officer of the SS, Waffen-SS, and then he is the logistics officer of the SS. His name is Adolf Eichmann. These are the two men that are mostly responsible for leading the conference that leads to what becomes the final solution. And they are going to ultimately come up with a plan that certain groups within the German government had been experimenting with using gas as a means to kill people, especially mental patients. In Germany, where they would have chambers in the back of trucks, and then they would take the hose and connect the exhaust to the chamber, and then they would die from carbon monoxide poisoning as they rev the engines. And so that's kind of where the whole thing comes from. And so you have this large-scale mass murder of Jews that are going to happen by gas. He ends up being assassinated, and he's the highest-ranking Nazi official that ever gets assassinated. Adolf Eichmann ends up escaping after World War II to Brazil, but the Israeli secret police, the Secret Service, ends up capturing him and bringing him back to Israel to face trial. Which ultimately he is found guilty of. Oops. So the final solution of the Jewish question was to exterminate the Jews in large numbers. They were done in two ways. The concentration camps were built, and Jews that were capable of working would be worked in these camps in the harshest and worst conditions, so badly so that when they are liberated, they're malnourished. The psychological damage that has been done is pretty significant. But they built a lot of concentration camps in Germany and other places to house Jews for the purpose of holding them for labor purposes. The largest of which was a place called Buchenwald, which housed as many as 200,000 prisoners at any given time. The rest of the Jews and other groups that were not wanted in Germany would be mass murdered. And they are going to create in the industrial, it's the industrialization of murder, it was what it is. So they built them for the mass execution. And the most infamous of which was Auschwitz. Auschwitz executed roughly 12,000 people a day in the several years in operation, and that was about 1.6 million people in total, 1.3 million of which were Jews themselves. And the way they had done this is that they would well, I'll get into that a little bit, but this Auschwitz is the most infamous of those death camps, and it wasn't the only one. And here is a map of like some of the larger camps and such. The red are the death camps. Here's Auschwitz, Birkenau. Birkenau was the concentration camp that was linked into Auschwitz. The people who worked in Birkenau, the Jews and such, helped with body removals and other things. They became, in a way, collaborators for their own self purpose of surviving through this, I guess. And so they must live with the fact that they helped the Nazis pull this off. Buchenwald, the other one I mentioned, is right here. But yeah, these are all some of the major concentration and death camps that were built for the purpose of murder and labor. Here's some pictures of people who had been liberated by American armies. Later, also the Soviets liberated a lot of these camps as well, including Auschwitz. You can see that they're malnourished. They're almost like skeletons because they're so undernourished and overworked. Here's some of the homes or the places that they lived. You can see that they're basically shelves that they would use their pans that they would get food from to sleep on as pillows. This is one of the labor camps. It was a mining camp. You can see like the prisoner uniforms that they wore as they worked 12-hour shifts every day without breaks. And if you fell behind and didn't pull your part, you were harassed or killed by the prisoner and guards. This is not a children's camp, but children were concentrating here. This is part of, I think, the Birkenau concentration camp that was connected with Auschwitz. And there was a doctor there, a very infamous doctor named Joseph Mengele. He is going to do a lot of experimentation on kids and people, and he especially was looking for twins, where he could do an experiment on one and then use the other one as a control. And so terrible things that they did to them. And the sad fact is that Joseph Mengele will end up escaping and never caught and brought to justice. And so he is one that became known as the Angel of Death. This is the gates into Auschwitz. The thing on top here says "Work makes you free." The whole reason that this was able to murder so many people is because they deceived the Jews that they were going to a labor camp. And as they arrive, they're being told they need to take a shower, they need to delace them, so that, they don't spread disease. And so they're walking and, their Jews tell them, yeah, you're just going to go take a shower. You have signs that say, godliness is cleanliness. And so they would walk them, eventually, taking their clothes, having them hang them up on hooks, give them that deception that they're going to get them back. But as they walk into here, this is the gas chambers in which they murdered millions of people. There were, you don't see them anymore, but they had shower heads on the top here to kind of make it look like one giant shower. And so as they're walking naked, they would close the door behind them, and then somebody on the roof would drop in crystals that, when exposed to air, would turn into gas, known as Zyklon B. And then they would, the gas would take effect and murder the people in the chamber. And then once the bodies were taken, they would put them into the crematoriums, and these, they would put the bodies on here, and then this thing would push their bodies into the furnaces where they would be burned to ash and then go up the smokestacks. And that's what happened to so many of them. So the war is, when it's over and, the Nazis lose, there's a decision by the Allied powers to put people on trial who should be responsible. And it's hard to put every single person who was part of the Holocaust on trial, right? You need a number of, all the prison guards, everybody who is part of this, the commandants of the camps. So they decided to go for the top officials, and people who other people who are responsible will see some justice, and some will escape it, sadly. But they decided to put 22 of the top Nazi leaders that were remaining. Guys like Adolf Hitler don't go on trial because he kills himself. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, kills himself when cornered by the Allies. The number 3 guy in Nazi party was this guy right here, is Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Luftwaffe and part of Hitler's inner circle going back to the 1920s. So he was the top official that gets captured. But they put a lot of them on trial for crimes against humanity. This is the first time in history that this has ever happened, and it wouldn't be the last. 12 of them would be hanged. 7 of them would be given life in prison. 3 were acquitted. And 1 committed suicide before hanging, and that was Hermann Goering. He was able to get a hold of a cyanide pill and killed himself before he was to meet his fate in being hanged. So other trials do occur also going after doctors who committed experiments against people, these prisoners. Judges that sentenced them and who helped support the Nazi regime, all those things. There were more trials, but the big ones were the head Nazi leaders. You can see them all sitting right here. Nuremberg trials, lead to some changes. There's a 4th Geneva Convention, and it extends how the treatment of civilians during times of war. It creates the Nuremberg Principles, which defines what a war crime is. And of course, the Nuremberg Code was standardizes the ethics behind human experimentation. So, that's something that does come out of these trials. So the Holocaust is the big one, and it's the one directly mentioned in the historical development by the College Board. But there are other examples, and one of them happened actually before World War II, and it's World War I, and the Armenians. The Armenians were Christian minorities that lived within the Ottoman Empire that, ended up getting scapegoated for some of the problems that the Ottoman Empire will go through. And, not to mention the fact that, when World War I happened, the Armenians aren't fully supportive of the Ottoman, especially the Young Turks, that have been trying to Turkify the state, and they had no desire to convert to Islam or to become a part of that. They wanted to keep their own cultural identity. So being Armenian and Christian in the empire meant that you had to pay higher taxes, you were untrustworthy, and they were generally treated as unequals. So when World War I isn't going well for the Ottomans, and they begin to scapegoat the Armenians for the reasons why they're not doing well. And so they began to forcibly remove them from their homes. They had death squads that would go out and kill Armenians as well. But many of them were forced to march into the desert with little water and protection, and many of them die from exhaustion and dehydration. But the whole Holocaust itself, or not the Holocaust, but the Armenian Genocide is going to lead to the deaths of about 1.5 million Armenians, and then about 1 million of them would be displaced from their homes altogether. To this day, the state of Turkey does not acknowledge that these events ever happened. They deny it completely ever did, even though the historical evidence is overwhelmingly that they did. We also move to another example the College Board says that we should talk about, and that is what happens in Cambodia in the 1970s. So Cambodia is a country that's right next to Vietnam. And during the Vietnam War, the United States is going to bomb Cambodia because of many of the supply trains that helped support the rebel fighters in South Vietnam went through Cambodia, as well as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so dropping bombs onto Cambodia to stop this from happening ends up destabilizing the government. And the man that you see here that I am too close to is a guy named Pol Pot. He will eventually come to power. He is a Marxist-Leninist, basically a communist. And he is one who wants to create a communist farming utopia. he wants to return the Cambodian people back to a time when life was more simplistic, and so this whole idea of creating a utopian society means that he wanted to remove the people who do not fit into that mold. And so his organization, his group known as the Khmer Rouge, would end up targeting multiple groups that they deemed as undesirables within their country that they want to remove through genocide. So Chinese Cambodians, Vietnamese Cambodians, the Cham, who were a Muslim minority that lived in Cambodia at the time, were all targets of this. But it didn't stop there. It's anybody who supported pro-Western ideas, individuals who had any intellectualism, any smarts, people who wore glasses, because glasses was a symbol of intellectualism, became targets of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. But the whole thing is one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. It led to the deaths of anywhere between 1.5 to 3 million people. Nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population was murdered by the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's regime over the time that he was in power. But yeah, that's another example of the ethnic cleansing genocide that occurs in the 20th century. The last of the three examples, or of the examples, I should say, of provided by College Board as ones we should talk about, is the Tutsi and Rwanda in the 1990s. So we're fast forwarding way ahead of where we've been with Unit 7. But Rwanda was once a Belgian colony, and it's very ethnically diverse. You know, similar to what we talked about, when you superimpose these borders, you're going to end up with multi-ethnical countries, right? And Rwanda is no exception. There were two main tribes of people that lived within Rwanda's borders, the Tutsi and the Hutu. The Belgian government and the colonial rulers and such favored the Tutsi over them. The Tutsi themselves, they had lighter skin, they were generally taller. And so, despite being the minority group inside Rwanda, by not very much, but they were the minority group, the Belgium colonial government favored them to help govern. And so, after independence is won, and Belgian government gives Rwanda its independence, there would be continuing tensions between the two sides. And so when the economy began to struggle and there were wide-scale food shortages that occurred in Rwanda during the early 1990s, that leads to more ethnic tension. And so the thing that sets this all together is that the president of Rwanda, who was a Hutu, his plane crashes on April 6th of 1994. And there's no way of knowing who actually caused the plane to crash. But ultimately, the Hutu militias immediately blamed the Tutsi rebels for shooting it down. And the Hutus had control of the radios. And so they have been pushing propaganda onto the people, the anti-Tutsi propaganda. But after all this happens, the radio signals go out, and the thing that was said on the radios is time to cut down the tall trees, which is the basically signal for kill the Tutsis. And so this genocide that happens, or this ethnic cleansing, it only happens over the course of 100 days before UN peacekeepers can involve themselves to try to stop this. But it's estimated to as many as 800,000 to maybe even 1 million. And about 75% of the Tutsi population was murdered. And we're not talking about guns and things like that. We're talking about people taking their gardening tools and going to murder their neighbors. And so one of the worst genocides in such a short period of time will occur. Many are more displaced and forced to flee to neighboring countries like Uganda. But there is different schools of thought whether this was about ethnic cleansing or it was something much deeper. As I mentioned, the famine that was going on, there was just a highly densely populated area with not enough ability to have resources to spread. So some scholars do believe this was a Malthusian crisis, where there was just too many. It was overpopulated, and this was the sad reality that some people felt that they needed to go because of the shortages of materials and such. But that's different viewpoints of different scholars within the historical community. Okay, so I've got to hurry this up because I'm about to have class comes back in here. Ukraine and the Soviet Union. This is something we talked about before, where Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans are going to push, unreasonable quotas, especially to the people of Ukraine. And if they don't meet quotas, they were punished. Not to mention that there were food shortages, and because they wanted to use whatever food to trade, that led to more people dying. And so you have a famine and deportation to gulags that led to the deaths of somewhere between 6 to 7 million Ukrainian people, known as the Holodomor. And that is something that doesn't come out publicly known until like 50 years later. The Soviet government controlled the message, and they wouldn't allow outsiders to come in and report things and report to the world. So this is something that was covered up during the 1920s and 30s that doesn't get learned about until the 1980s, where a ambassador to Canada from the Soviet Union actually bravely says this is something that happened, and so the world becomes more aware of it. You also have the rape of Nanjing, or the massacre of Nanjing, but this is during the Sino-Japanese War. So when Japan invades China, I got to really hurry. So there's lots of looting, rape on a large scale. They build rape camps, and so they would also have competitions who could kill the most with swords, and so somewhere between 200 and 3,000 people would be killed as a result of that. You also have Bangladesh in 1971, where East Pakistan began to have this large nationalist movement. And so this is going to lead to 300,000 to 3 million people that were engaged in this mass rape campaign that it does occur. This is not a College Board example, so I'm just going to go briefly through that. And then, of course, Burundi. This is something that happened where there's multiple genocides that happened in Burundi. The first one happened in 1972, and then another one in 1993. But they were generally smaller compared to Rwanda, but it also is because of ethnic tensions that occurred in those countries. Okay, so that's it from Mr. Henry. I'm sorry to rush here at the end, but you have the PowerPoint, and we did get a chance to go through the examples that College Board does provide. With that being said, this is Mr. Henry signing off.